Just before we get started, in case you haven't subscribed to it yet, Mega Projects does have a sister channel called Side Projects where we talk about things that didn't quite make it onto the Mega Projects channel, but that doesn't mean they're less interesting. Normally we combine them into like a listicle style thing, so yeah, it's proving to be very popular. Side Projects is linked to below. Please do check it out if you feel like it, and let's get into today's video. The name Davy Crockett has become immortalized in the United States. Born in 1786, Crockett is remembered as the king of the frontier, a soldier, a politician, a folk hero, the likes of which we just don't see much of anymore. His death during the Battle of the Alamo only strengthens this almost mythical persona. But the name Davy Crockett has also been used for something entirely different. Accompanied by one of the smallest nuclear weapons ever built, the Davy Crockett weapon system was developed during the 1950s as the threat of a possible nuclear war with the Soviet Union appeared to grow. While this tactical nuclear recoilless gun was of course never used, it did provide an entirely different kind of threat to the massive atomic bombs produced by both countries. For the first time, small-scale nuclear weapons could now be used on the battlefield, and warfare was changed forever. Once the battle lines had been drawn after World War II, Europe became the most likely place that an armed conflict between the Soviet Union and NATO countries might arise. But the world had recently moved into the nuclear weapons age, which would likely change large-scale combat beyond recognition. The most likely point of contact in this hypothetical battle of Europe was at Fulda Gap, a lowland corridor that connected East and West Germany. It was here that NATO commanders believed Soviet tanks would come through should an invasion ever take place. Unsurprisingly, this is where the largest concentration of troops was stationed on both sides. 7 US divisions were stationed at the western mouth of the Fulda Gap, with the Soviet 8th Guard Army positioned to the east. Should a land war ever break out, both sides would have to make some deeply uncomfortable decisions. By the 1950s, the USA, the Soviet Union, and the UK had nuclear weapons, but these were large-scale atomic bombs, the likes of which were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. They were incredibly powerful, no doubt about that, but their destructive capabilities were of little use on a battlefield with both friendly and enemy soldiers in close proximity. NATO had another dilemma: the overwhelming Soviet superiority in terms of both men and tanks. It was generally agreed that if a full-scale invasion was to come through the Fulda Gap, NATO would need something a bit special to halt it. If only a small-scale tactical nuclear weapon could be deployed, one which was powerful enough to cause significant damage, but not so powerful that it would blow Europe apart. The bombs that had fallen on Japan were enormous contraptions, weighing 4,535 kilograms, 10,000 pounds, and measuring 3 meters, 10 feet in length. The only aircraft capable of lifting such monsters was the Behemoth B-29 Superfortress. They could cause terrible damage, but they were not easy to operate. Yet technology progressed at a rapid rate, and spurred on by the first Soviet nuclear test in 1949, the US began producing smaller and more compact nuclear devices. In the mid-1950s, the Army's Ordnance Corps began exploring the possibility of a tactical nuclear weapon, one small enough that it could be easily transported and fired quickly and easily from a specially designed launcher. Nothing like this had been produced before, so there were plenty of unknowns, but generally the Ordnance Corps was looking for a weapon with a range of between 500 and 4,000 yards, that's about 450 to 3,600 meters, with a sub-kiloton yield, a weapon with a strength of less than 1,000 tons of TNT. Just as a quick comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was equal to about 12 to 15,000 tons of TNT. In 1957, the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, announced it had constructed a lightweight, sub-kiloton yield fission warhead, and the project was subsequently passed to the Army's Chief of Ordnance, Major General John H. Hinrichs. He would be responsible for turning the warhead into a usable weapon. At this point, it wasn't entirely clear the best method to launch this small-scale weapon. A host of possibilities were considered, ranging from mortars to conventional artillery. But a recoilless rifle system was deemed to be the best option, as it was the simplest and lightest choice. A recoilless rifle is pretty much exactly what you think it is. It's a portable launcher which typically fires out a countermass, such as a gas canister, from the back, which essentially counteracts the gun's natural recoil. The weapon was eventually given the name Battle Group Atomic Delivery delivery system. Not exactly a humdinger of a title, and it was tested and constructed at a variety of military bases across the country. By 1958, a new name had arrived. It's not exactly clear how the name of a 19th century frontiersman came to be used, but the weapon was now known as the Davy Crockett weapon system, and after further testing, it entered service in 1961. The weapon came in two varieties: the light M28 120mm recoilless rifle with a range of approximately 2 kilometers (1.25 miles), and the heavy M29 155mm recoilless rifle with a range of about 4 kilometers (2.5 miles). Both were designed to fire the 34-kilogram M388 shell, which contains the Mk54 nuclear warhead, which weighed about 23 kilograms and had a yield of between 10 and 20 tons of TNT, making it by far the smallest nuclear warhead ever created. The Davy Crockett was designed to be loaded onto an armored personnel carrier, but would be fired from the ground using a tripod or a jeep where the gun would remain mounted. It was operated by a 3-man crew, and procedures dictated that a spotting round be fired first to gauge distances, using a non-nuclear shell, of course. The M388, along with the Mk54, would then be inserted into the nozzle, followed by a metal piston. There was a switch on the weapon which allowed the crew to adjust the height at which the warhead would detonate before the shooter finally pulled the trigger. And just like that, a tactical nuclear weapon was tearing towards an unaware Soviet tank crew at a speed of 160 kilometers an hour. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Crews were also encouraged to seek a protective shelter to fire from and, rather comically, to keep their heads down. While the Davy Crockett packed a hell of a punch for such a small package, it was also horribly inaccurate. Wherever it landed, it produced a lethal radiation dose of 100 sieverts within 150 meters, that's 500 feet, and a likely fatal dose of 6 sieverts within a 400-meter radius. It's generally considered that 8 sieverts is enough to kill you with or without medical treatment, but getting it to the right spot proved to be a bit of a nightmare. The lack of accuracy was said to be down to the poor aerodynamic shape of the shell, which earned it the nickname the finned watermelon. Only 2 live tests of Davy Crockett's were ever carried out. The first, codenamed Little Fella 1 on the 7th of July 1962, and the second, codenamed Little Fella 2 on the 17th of July, both at the same Nevada test site. The warhead from the first test detonated somewhere between 6 to 12 meters above the ground, roughly 2.7 kilometers from the launch location, producing a yield of 18 tons of TNT, making it at least 700 times less powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima. It had a rather important observer that day, Robert Kennedy, brother of the then President John F. Kennedy, who was in attendance to evaluate this potential new weapon in the battle against communism. The second test was not done using the recoilless gun. Instead, the warhead was suspended 0.9 meters above the ground, and it produced a slightly higher yield of 22 tons of TNT. Despite the accuracy problems, it appeared that Davy Crockett had passed the test. Over 2,000 were produced and deployed to the US Army between 1961 and 1971. They also underwent a huge amount of further testing without the nuclear warheads, probably in the hope of learning how to actually hit a target that it was aimed at. Instead of large numbers of troops carrying them into battle, they were limited to specialized atomic battle groups consisting of an officer and 12 men. Sadly for our story, but good for humanity, the Davy Crockett was never used in a real-life situation. The weapon's tail begins to peter out at this point. It was removed from US military use in Europe in 1967 and completely out of service by 1971. This was still 2 whole decades away from the end of the Cold War, so we have to assume that the weapon was withdrawn because it failed to meet its necessary standards. Not only was the weapon inaccurate, but it was also very time-consuming to assemble. The Kennedy administration was said to be far from enthused by the weapon, a sentiment echoed by commanders on the ground in Europe. Even though times had changed, it seemed it was still not the time to be using such weapons on the battlefield. One enthusiastic supporter of the weapon was West Germany's defense minister Franz Josef Strauss, who pushed the idea of arming German troops with the weapon. The US and NATO flat out rejected the idea, as it was deemed that a move might promote the use of nuclear weapons rather than their use as a last resort. Many wonderfully bizarre pieces of military hardware came out of the Cold War. You're watching megaprojects. You know that, as both the US and the Soviet Union egged each other on with how far they could go. Thankfully, the tactical nuclear weapon has never needed to be used, but the construction of the Davy Crockett did underline just how small they can be. While the threat of nuclear weapons may have diminished, that doesn't mean they've disappeared, and that includes tactical nuclear weapons. In fact, you'll be shocked at just how many there are. According to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, tactical nuclear weapons make up roughly 30 to 40% of American and Russian nuclear arsenals, nearly 100% of the Chinese and French, and all of the Israeli, Indian, and Pakistani arsenals. The one nuclear-capable country that no longer uses them is the United Kingdom. Considering that Russia and the US each have over 5,000 nuclear weapons each, there's an awful lot of tactical versions floating around out there. The newest American version, the W-76-2, went into production just last year, with the Trump administration stating that these weapons make the threat of nuclear war less likely because it gives the US more flexible deterrence, a puzzlingly vague statement. It's believed that this new weapon will have the strength equivalent of up to 5 kilotons of TNT, roughly a third of what was dropped on Hiroshima. Over 70 years since the introduction of the Davy Crockett, these kinds of weapons are still being produced in large numbers, probably more than most people realize. Technology has evolved dramatically over the decades, from the rudimentary recoilless gun that couldn't shoot straight to sophisticated warheads located inside tactical ballistic missiles capable of hitting targets thousands of miles away. While the number of truly catastrophic nuclear weapons has indeed fallen, our desire to retain the option of a neat and tidy nuclear attack has not diminished. However, it is still difficult to imagine a situation where this would be a viable choice. We've come a long way since the impending threat of World War III in the 1950s, when the eyes of the world stared with suspended fear at the Fulda Gap, waiting for the end of the world to begin. The fallout from a tactical nuclear weapon used today, in terms of both radiation and global response, would be severe, and that might just be enough to keep these weapons off the battlefield, at least for now. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. As I mentioned at the beginning, Mega Projects has a sister channel, Side Projects. Please do check that out. It's linked to below. And thank you for watching.